Welcome to Responding to Sexual Assault, a trauma-informed approach to law enforcement. This section of our training addresses the trauma-informed approach to sexual assault. We've all had the experience of someone who says something to us, even meaning well, that is not only not helpful, but it shuts us down. Has anyone ever been the one to actually do that? Me. I don't think it's an overstatement to say we almost have one opportunity to keep our victims on board, and that will happen at our first meeting. The brilliant Canadian social scientist Malcolm Gladwell is known for his work on many New York Times best-selling books. We're going to talk for a moment about the book called Blink. Blink explores the idea that people form impressions of others within the first 2 seconds of meeting them. Gladwell's term for this process is called thin slicing, which describes how the brain can quickly infer patterns from small amounts of experience. We take a few clues and make it the whole, all at the unconscious level, and all very, very fast. The power of the adaptive subconscious is that even after spending more time with that person, in this example, we generally maintain the initial feelings. In other words, we almost don't get a second chance to make a good first impression. This certification course may offer a longer training section in interviewing and interrogation, so what I'm choosing to present is a summary version of what's most important about trauma-informed interviewing. As you've just heard my former colleague Russell Strand remind us, science should lead us. Understanding the neuroscience behind trauma-informed interviewing should frame everything we do in this area, just like it does in the science of how we approach crime scenes. I cringe to this day, remembering how 30 years ago, I was second on scene of a double homicide and a suicide. I walked into the crime scene, carefully but still, in my street clothes and my street shoes. Ugh, no coveralls, no mask, my hair was down. It's just what we did then. You can't do better if you don't know better, and now we know better. The fact is, our victims are, in fact, evidence. Actually the best evidence if approached with the right interviewing techniques, treated with confidence and compassion, and provided with appropriate information and referrals. Of course, this means that the opposite is also true. Given the importance of the victim as evidence, any mistake made during an interview can have a disastrous effect on the victim's credibility and cooperation. And the same is true for the initial report writing for the first responders as well. This in turn reduces the likelihood that the case will be successfully investigated and prosecuted. One of the primary mistakes that is often seen is treating the victims not only like evidence, but in fact like suspects. Again, we just have to adjust our lens to get the basics right. Dr. Jim Hopper, who you've heard from, reminds us of the importance of offering choices and options for victims to counterbalance the dynamic of disempowerment. Because the victim was dominated and disrespected by the suspect, giving back some control, the types of control that are simple for us to do can change the entire dynamic between us and our victims. In the next section, you'll watch a video of an actual interview with an 18-year-old student, Ava. In this case, the detective directed the interview and then imposed his own biases by telling the victim how her memory should work. You can see she picks up on his doubt about her own story, and you can see her confidence affected, and as such, her trust is very quickly diminished. So let's begin with some of the basics. Some of the more well-known trauma-informed interviewing practices include techniques such as ensure a private and comfortable space for the interview. Allow victims to utilize a support person in the interview and beyond. One might even be assigned to them through a program in your county. Take time to build rapport at the outset. Just take time. Avoid retelling traumatic stories and using triggering words, and don't use triggering words rather where possible, including questions such as, what were you wearing at the time of the incident? Don't ever tell them that you understand or that it's going to be okay, or that you've had an experience just like theirs. Your experience or any one of our experiences is not like their experience. Avoid showing visual or graphic evidence which may have the potential to re-traumatize. Use the International Chiefs of Police Quick Reference Guide to Successful Trauma-Informed Victim Interviewing that I've provided as your go-by. It's excellent. It walks you right through with detailed examples of how to ask and how not to ask, and it provides you with the research behind each suggestion. Here are a couple of examples. Instead of why did you or why didn't you, ask, when such and such happened, what were your feelings and thoughts? Or, are you able to tell me more about what happened when? Avoid anything related to a chronological account. I know we love this in law enforcement, but we got to put that to the side. Ask instead, what are you able to tell me about what was happening before, during, and after the assault? It's our job to try to create a timeline. Yes, we can do it with some of what they offer to us, but we can't count on them to offer that to us, or we need to be careful about it. So don't ask, what were you wearing? But sometimes we get valuable evidence from clothes that you were wearing during an assault. Even if you've thrown them in the laundry, we'd like to collect the clothes you were wearing as evidence and pick up those items at any time or at a place convenient for you. Don't say, why did you go with the suspect, or why didn't you leave? But can you describe what you were thinking and feeling when you were with the suspect? And can you describe what was happening while you were in the car, the room, the house? Or what were your thoughts and feelings while you were in the car, the room, or the house? Just remember, thoughts and feelings, feelings and thoughts. In addition to the basics, here are 9 practical techniques to use in interviews involving trauma or sensitive topics. I'll use the word interviewee to cover everyone: victims, witnesses, and suspects. Again, a lot of these suggestions, they really go against the grain of a lot of what we were taught for decades in law enforcement. But we encourage you to be transparent about the role and the process, and that can assist in building rapport. If we start the interview by explaining the investigation process and the investigator's role in that process, it's so helpful. This includes how the information will be used. People just don't understand law enforcement. Outlining the process using simple language and with as much detail as possible provides the interviewee with a better understanding of what to expect. This helps to establish trust, and it makes them feel more at ease. I think you cannot go wrong throughout this entire process by asking the interviewee again and again if they have any questions or if they need a break. Here's an example of how to begin. After introductions, I ask the person I'm interviewing if they know why they're here, and then I listen, and I add to that if needed. It seems simple, as though they should know why they're here, but honestly, you'd be surprised at what you might hear, as people generally, again, don't understand the criminal justice system. And really, why would they? Next, it's important for me that you understand and are comfortable, this is me talking to them, with talking with me today. So I want to begin by explaining the interview process and to tell you, if you have any questions, I want you to feel comfortable enough to ask them. Can you do this for me? This type of question asking is called joining. I realize, though, this is me continuing, that it's hard sometimes to tell someone you don't know what you need. So let's come up with a way, maybe a word or a hand gesture, so that you can let me know when you need to slow something down, or if you're not ready to talk about something at any point. Do you have any ideas? Again, get them to join in helping you create parameters around this experience and talking to us. Let them tell you what feels comfortable to them. Mostly, though, people just don't know how to articulate that. So I suggest often just raising their hand, requiring no words, as a way to communicate to me something important to them. Again, I just say, if you're ever uncomfortable about anything, you need to slow down, you need a break, just put up your hand. It's so simple and it works. If at any time I sense something is off, I ask them then if they need to take a break, or again, if they have any questions. I just keep slowing it down. Control and choice. It's important that people who've experienced trauma have a sense of control and feel respected and heard, because we all want to be heard, don't we? This can further be facilitated in an interview with victims and witnesses, for example, by allowing the interviewee to somewhat choose where the interview is to be held. And again, this really goes against a lot of the grain of what we're taught in law enforcement. And in fact, where to even sit in the interview room if they come to us, alongside, as discussed, making sure the interviewee knows that they can ask for a break or change their mind about their participation at any time. And just giving somebody that freedom actually helps them to not respond to walking out and slowing down and shifting. If your agency has a policy requiring video recording and that requires a certain sitting placement in the room, then explain that to the person being interviewed, highlighting how important it is to document accurately their experience and story, hence the videotaping. No one ever likes feeling tricked, even by omission. So if you're videotaping them, tell them. Follow their lead and minimize interruptions. Starting the interview with questions such as, would you please share what you feel comfortable sharing with me about your experience that brought you here? Demonstrates that you're here to listen to their story in their own words, and it gives them control of the narrative. While I was at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, when we taught advanced interviewing and interrogation, a significant part of the training was conducting interviews with role players while being videotaped. The role player's role was to provide more information or not, depending on how they felt about how they were treated by the person conducting their interview. At the end of the scenario, feedback was provided to the students, again, all active law enforcement, and there was a lot of learning in those interactions because we videotaped, and videotapes don't lie. Much like how I felt when I saw my initial efforts at videotaping this content, it's eye-opening to watch yourself on camera. The biggest shared weakness in how we all tend to interview is how often we interrupt. Before the debrief, we asked the students to guess at how often they interrupted, and they were wrong by at least twice and closer to 3 times their guess. Plainly put, it's really hard not to interrupt, and it can also be really hard to learn to stay quiet when the person being interviewed is being quiet. But we have got to let them fill the quiet space, and if we give them the time to do it, they will. I solved a cold case by doing this. To be honest, mostly I just run out of themes. We were 5 hours into the interview, and it was almost 6 p.m. My team and I had flown up to Sacramento that morning from San Diego. The woman I was interviewing was a co-suspect in the murder of a sailor 10 years previously. We needed her testimony against her former boyfriend, who we knew murdered our sailor, but we could not prove it. This was 10 years, again, after the original homicide. They both moved from San Diego to Sacramento, and the suspect had gone on to marry and have children in that 10 years. But her life, the woman I was interviewing, had really gone nowhere. She was the caretaker for her nephew, who was 100% disabled. We, my team and I, were under the impression, because that's what she told us, that she had not had any contact with the suspect for many, many years, that they'd both gone their separate ways. On the night of the homicide, our sailor had been at her apartment, and then he did not show up for work on Monday. When missing persons went to inquire, there was so much blood in her bedroom, the coroner called it a homicide even without a body. She admitted our sailor was beaten and dragged from her apartment, and that she did not know who the 2 men were that did that. Her boyfriend, our suspect's fingerprints were all over her apartment, but they would be, so not unusual. We just could not get her off that story. So again, the 10 years passed and I reopened the investigation. So back to my interview. At this point in the day, again, we were all tired, hungry. She was tired. I took off my special agent hat and I said, "Shelley, woman to woman." I actually said that, woman to woman. And then I asked her how she felt about the fact that the suspect seemed to have gotten right along with his personal life, marrying someone else and having babies. I asked her how that made her feel. Initially, she played it off, but I sensed there was something, so I kept my mouth shut. I still have that video, and trust me, I almost blew it. We could never have anticipated what came next. It got so uncomfortable in those moments of quiet, but I continued to stay with it. Within what seemed like a long time, she exploded. I mean, came up out of her seat. We were both sort of sitting back at that point. And she said she was not happy at all about how their lives had turned out so differently, and proceeded to tell me that she saw the suspect regularly despite his marriage, and he came around, when convenient for him, of course, to have sex with her. After more woman-to-woman discussion, she agreed to a consent call where she told him she was being re-interviewed by San Diego PD and NCIS, and she asked him, this was from a script that I created, if she was charged in the murder of our sailor, would he, our suspect, finally come forward and admit he'd murdered our sailor? All I can tell you is he wasn't having any of that. He just told her repeatedly to keep her mouth shut, and he wasn't nice about it. I think even up until that moment, she still believed he would come through for her. In the end, they were both charged, and she refused to testify against him, but she did tell us that he was there and that he did it. So she ended up being loyal to the end to him. And I share all this to tell you that minimizing interruptions can have some surprising results, and also to speak to the odd shame and twisted loyalty we see in so many of our victims of violence. Maintaining rapport. Simple appreciation. Openly acknowledging throughout the interview that you appreciate the situation is not easy, and that some of the questions are difficult, by saying things like, I can see this is hard for you to talk about. Regularly thank the participant for sharing their evidence and views throughout the interview, including at the end of their interview. Neutral, non-direct language. With the understanding you now have that trauma can negatively impact a person's memory or recall, and that this may limit the level of detail you're able to obtain, avoid asking why questions directly. That also can be perceived as challenging the suspect's recollection of events. Instead of that, encourage the participant to continue sharing information by posing questions like, are you able to tell me what else happened? In general, law enforcement should consider reframing questions that start with why, directives such as explain to me. Instead, how about, can you help me to understand such and such? Can you help me to understand such and such? Tell me more about that. Requests for chronological accounts regarding time with prompts such as, and then what happened, is not something to do. Using sensory memories. And we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about how to interview and how to document in a written format. Asking interviewees about smells, sounds, tastes, sights, or touch can be a powerful way to indirectly place them back at the relevant scene of events to assist with their recall. For example, do you recall any particular smell or sounds at the time of the traumatic event? You'll be surprised at what you hear, and it can be very impactful. I had a very close friend of mine disclose to me that after her sexual assault, the smell of beer, any time, made her immediately feel nauseous. She directly correlates that smell with the breath of the man who assaulted her. Environment and safety. In keeping with the control and choice principles already mentioned, we discussed giving thought to the interview location and the positioning of the interviewees in the room. Ensure that the victim or even the witness can sit beside their support person and can exit the room if needed. I know we want a victim or a witness to feel free to tell us what they might feel uncomfortable saying in front of someone, so I explain sometimes why I might want them alone. But I give them the choice, and sometimes it's just giving them the choice that can change the dynamics. They can also have their support system just go sit outside for a few minutes. That's all fair. But we have to actually sort of give them permission to ask for that. And we can always go back later if we have a reason to believe someone might have been withholding and just ask them for an opportunity to talk through a few other things by yourselves at that point. Also ensure the interview location is in a private and secure space where the discussion can't be seen or overheard. Allow the participant to keep their phone on silent, of course, so that they feel in control of who they can communicate with during the interview. I know this seems counterintuitive to us and to how we've practiced before, but it's important. Give warning about difficult questions. If in doubt about whether or not to ask a particularly difficult or sensitive question, it can be useful to gently encourage the topic by asking, would you feel comfortable if I talked about, or would it be okay if I ask you about such and such? This allows you to gauge their willingness to engage in that conversation, at least in that moment, and it's in keeping with the underlying principles of control and choice mentioned above. Again, thoughts and feelings, control, and choice. This approach should also be taken when interviewing witnesses to warn them of personal or confronting questions. Prepare for multiple interviews. This goes against a lot of what we've been taught before. As is often the case in sexual assault investigations, by the time we see the victim, he or she has been both up all night, but often also has completed a 4 to 5 hour sexual assault examination too. And in that examination, they've been interviewed. As discussed earlier, I often had contact with victims at least twice, and usually 3 times, to preview the summary or the statement that I created during the interviews prior to submission. Always. I never deviated from this practice. I see it as my job to check in with them, and if there is something I am not entirely sure about, something I don't feel like I fully understand, I need to ask for clarification, never assuming everything. And even though I spent hours, 5, 6, 7 hours prior talking through the event, when I had them review my summary, every time the victim still had to change some part of the details for much better clarity. Again, what I hear and think I understand may not be what they mean, right? This happens in all our personal relationships too. In other words, if I'm saying the product I'm submitting is their summary, I want them to be okay with it. No matter how well-intended I am, it is human nature to not entirely understand what someone else is trying to explain to us. Again, this happens in all our personal relationships with people we know. It's a mistake to think we'll get it exactly right with people we don't know, and about an event where the telling of it can make or break a prosecutor's decision to file the case. While the trauma-informed techniques described may seem quite straightforward and logical, the challenge for us as investigators is applying them in a considered but very flexible manner. This requires us to balance the needs and comfort level of the interviewee with our rigorous process that enables us to make some good, sound financial findings. So again, it's all balance. Trauma-informed interviewing techniques, when used intentionally and appropriately, can truly facilitate authentic communication and assist us in obtaining the best possible evidence in emotionally charged circumstances. In this training, due to both time limitations and the fact we're not in person to be able to role play, I'd like you to watch a clip from an IACP video called Trauma-Informed Interview Techniques. This was the shortest and best training aid I could find without building my own. It's provided through the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control Conference. Now we're going to shift to the more practical applications of interviewing and documenting our interviews. Our opinions have no place in our reports. If you mention the victim was crying and so you stop the interview, for example, that's what you say. You don't say they appear upset because we are extrapolating that. You just report the facts. If the interviewee looks tired, then ask them. And if they say that they are, report that answer. The majority of our cases revolve around consent. If it was given, and if so, how? We must make our suspects answer this question. So we have to document the no. Never ask, did you say no? Always ask, how did you communicate that you did not consent? It's likely that the victim hasn't really thought this through, so we need to help them think it through. There's going to be something in their body language movement or lack of it that when explained and in context can start to build a picture of a lack of consent. Again, we've got to assist them with telling their story by being patient and asking open-ended questions. Here are some examples of the no, at least in their minds. Wait. I can't. We shouldn't. Stop. It's late. I'm married. Or you're married. I'm menstruating. In Gavin DeBecker's book called The Gift of Fear, he writes that women are so worried about offending somebody that if we're standing, in his example, in front of an elevator at night and the door's open and there's a man inside the elevator, in a second, we will not want to get in that elevator. But the high majority of us will get in that elevator because we don't want to hurt that person's feelings. And I share that with you because that's really true. Many women will never have sexual intercourse while they're menstruating. If this is articulated by our victim, which may only happen if you ask, we actually even have to consider corroborating this with other partners, but at the very least, we need to report it. Can you imagine having to explain why you might need to explore this as a method of corroborating a victim's story? Always remember that this can be such a cost to our victims for telling. So ask them, tell me about your body language, and give them examples if you need to. Were you crying, not moving? Then you're going to explore all parts of what happens to a woman's body or a man's body when they're in a situation where trauma overtakes the brain. Passive resistance, like trying to move or putting a pillow or covers over their head, is in my example. Disassociation, freezing, numbness, all the things that James Hopper's videos have shown us so well. If a victim makes a statement like they felt they weren't in their body, ask them to describe more about that. Often they can articulate floating above and watching or fixating on a point, a doorknob, a dresser handle, a light fixture. We saw this in the Mad Men video. And for years when I worked child sexual abuse, this was never uncommon in the interviews that we did. These kids, when they were being repeatedly abused, would go off somewhere else. We now know it's not unusual to delay reporting. We need to document this, but we also need to document all of this as well. The delayed reporting, diminished alertness, numbness, dulled sensory affective and memory functions, vomiting, nausea, paralyzing anxiety, pronounced inner tremor, obsession to washing or cleaning themselves afterwards. Again, these are some things that they may do afterwards. We want to ask about that. A response to the trauma, hysteria, confusion and crying, bewilderment. Document by asking what happened during the assault, but also what has happened afterwards. You'll be giving a chance to practice this in your next assignment. They don't call it rape. As mentioned several times now, many rape survivors do not call their experience rape, nor do the rapists. Not knowing what to call it is unfortunately normal for many of our victims. We continue to fall prey to the ideal victim theory. Survivors who do not look this way are blamed for the assault. They are not morally above reproach. These are the features of the common narrative, not the features of the common experience. But unfortunately, a lot of our victims buy into this. We learned that through Dr. David Lisak's researching the research, the interviewing of college males whose actions met the legal definition of sexual assault admitted to sexual assault. I want you to leverage this knowledge, at least with the suspects. We're going to talk more about this, but first I want you to watch a TED Talk video by Kelsey Adams, a PhD criminology candidate and multidisciplinary researcher. Her doctoral project aims to better understand sexual violence survivors' experiences, especially in the aftermath of assault. It's important for us as investigators to truly understand the depth of the shame and confusion associated with this crime and why they, men and women, may respond this way. The acknowledgement rate of those who do not identify their assault as rape is 40% for women and 20% for men. Here is the power of labels, why many rape survivors don't call it rape. The goal of this section of training is twofold: to highlight again the predatory nature of sexual assault and how simple it is to carry out, and to utilize the understanding of this dynamic in our interviews with the perpetrators. Combining Lisak's interview research questions can be considered as well. I provided you with another link to go back to review those questions. I've also provided a sexual assault timeline sample I created, which uses the categories above. It provides step-by-step guidance on how to document each category: premeditation, targeting, and victim selection; grooming the victim, grooming witnesses on both sides; isolation, the crime itself, and post-crime behavior to include damaging victims' credibility; and influencing witnesses on both sides. And again, you can take part of these elements and form a stalking case from them too. Given the statistical likelihood that a rapist has committed previous rapes and other acts of violence, investigate current and past social media networks, postings, and, yes, past relationships and hookups. High rates of battering, bullying, overlap in relationships with sexual violence, and that does demand the questioning of past girlfriends or boyfriends. If prior victims are reluctant to come forward themselves, they may not be so hesitant knowing that they are not the only ones. Project Callisto, the app we mentioned earlier for confidential reporting and other avenues for blind or anonymous reporting, are based on this premise. Additionally, this knowledge may well strengthen the prosecutor's leverage. Here's a sample of the timeline. Now to the interesting part 2, interrogation. Consider waiting. There is no administrative regulatory requirement to interrogate a suspect within a certain time frame. And here are the benefits. It allows us more time to complete other more time-sensitive investigative steps, like a more thorough background on the suspect to include prior relationships or other possible leads to additional victims. It also increases the suspect's stress. It gives us time for multiple trauma-informed interviews of the victim, which is most beneficial, as that also assists with building trust in that relationship. Waiting allows more time to re-interview witnesses after they've spoken to the suspect whose story may be changing. More time to complete other more time-sensitive investigative steps like preservation letters for social media and electronic devices can be done in this same time frame. Because suspects often use a host of electronic media and computers, phones, to facilitate unlawful activities. While technology permits suspects to commit crimes like stalking remotely or to get friends to harass or intimidate the victim or some of the victim's friends, it also provides electronic breadcrumbs as criminal evidence via images, audio, video, and text. If your agency doesn't have a Cellbrite system, identify who has this professional extraction tool. and see if you have a memorandum of understanding so that your agency can borrow it. There are 3 avenues to obtain the data: state or a federal search warrant, exigent circumstances, or voluntary or cooperative consent. If you're taking phones, you're going to have to ask the victim and witnesses who they've talked to, Skyped, FaceTimed, and or texted about the crime. You'll have to get their usernames, passwords, and type of encryption if any is used. Good luck with a lot of that, but we've got to ask. And remember the value of geotagging. If the phone's GPS is turned on, there is metadata on the photos. If you can, you may want to have all this information before you interrogate the suspect. But I get it. It simply takes time to get all this information, but it gives you more of the picture to have in your back pocket. While reviewing these communications, remember we're looking for evidence of stalking's course of contact. Again, 2 or more acts of intimidation, harassment, surveillance, threats that torment, terrorize, or terrifies that person that serves no legitimate purpose. We may also be looking for evidence of a drug-facilitated sexual assault. Now that is another class entirely, but when conducting searches, especially if the victim expressed a loss of consciousness or ability to recollect or ability to move, for example, look for containers, nasal spray, eye drops, liquid breath mint containers, Benadryl, antihistamines, nausea medication, muscle relaxants, or depression and anxiety meds. We had a man that would actually use Benadryl to relax his victims, and then he murdered them. 2 cases, same guy. When looking at their computer or phone, look at receipts for online drugs and internet searches for how-to. As importantly, this is the time to conduct the pretext calls, emails, texts, and or voicemails to the suspect by the victim or by a friend of the suspect or the victim. Once law enforcement is involved, you can leverage the serious nature of the crime against those individuals who initially may be trying to protect the suspect, but read them their rights for stalking, and they may change their mind, especially if you have a little more information that you can share about what you think actually might have happened that night. Often the suspect employs these individuals to harass the victim or the victim's friends too. Bring them in and educate them on the seriousness of harassment and or stalking or interfering in a police investigation. Once the suspect invokes their rights, all bets are off for this type of communication. So consider taking your time getting to the interrogation. Considerations for pretext communications. Get administrative permissions. In North Carolina, for example, it's a one-party consent state. Prepare a script. That's what I did with my homicide co-suspect. She would get so flabbergasted when she was talking to me about it. I just had a script there and I held it up for her and had her read it as she was talking to him. And otherwise she would go off on tangents, and you know how that goes. So go soft. Maybe don't accuse, why did you rape me? Instead, go with something a little more simple. Did we have sex? That speaks to no recollection, so you could probably extrapolate that later to couldn't give permission, lack of consent. Have your victim say, I don't remember or recall. Did we use protection? I'm worried about pregnancy. There are many variables that would dictate the language used. More direct. Why did you have sex with me after I pushed you away and I told you to stop? You knew I was out of it and didn't know what was going on, but you had sex with me anyway. Why did you do it? This kind of questioning is very effective between people that actually had friendships before this event took place. You're never going to get a confession. Really, that's the truth of it all. But failure to deny is still impactful. Apologies can work just as well. So a direct confession just can't be our goal. The goal is to shine the light on the full range of an accused's conduct, exposing predatory behavior, exploitation, manipulation, and intimidation, and documenting it thoroughly, because chances are you're never going to get that direct confession from the suspect. He may say it to some of his friends, but he's not probably going to say it to you. The sexual assault timeline provided will really help with organizing this information. Get the suspect past the rights waiver. We want them to talk to us. In the military criminal investigative organizations like NCIS, we were required to read a suspect their rights all the time because they were often ordered by their superior to come to our office, so they were considered in custody. As a result, I did this more often than not. Unlike local police departments who can ask somebody to come in and then they actually go through something on and they videotape it saying you're free to leave at any time, we had to use the rights waiver. So the simplest way I found to both build rapport and to get a suspect past the rights advisory is I spent a lot of time on the rights advisory. And I say, I really want to make sure that you understand and that you can stop this interview at any time, but that unfortunately, I cannot talk to you without you waiving your rights. I then repeat, because they look a little confused. They think they're looking for the trick. I then repeat, if you just want to listen to some of what I know, you have to waive your rights, but you're not required to talk to me. You can just sit there and listen. And that's when I see the light bulb going on. I can just sit there and listen. I don't have to talk to you. You do not have to talk to me. But I cannot talk to you about what's going on unless you waive your rights. And that's a protection of you. I wish I didn't have to do it. I then try to slowly bring them around to talking and telling me their side of what happened. I rarely confront. I just take a lot of notes and I focus on the inconsistencies and the absurdities. But first, I get an admission of the acts because they're going to tell you likely that they had sex with this person. I then document the grooming. How did you meet? Followed by how they got the victim isolated. Then I require the suspect to articulate how the victim gave consent. And again, I just say, this is for your protection. You need to help me understand what your view of this entire situation was because the other person is saying something entirely different. But before we talk about articulating consent, I want to mention how important it is to include in your investigation plan questions involving past acts. As research has indicated, the majority of rapes and sexual assaults are committed by a minority of men who repeat the behavior. When I was teaching such a class at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, I had 48 students, and only 4 were female in this class. And when we got to this type of section, I just said, do we not know, ladies, who kind of the predator hound type, I love dogs, so I hate to say that, the guys that are not nice guys, don't we know who they are? And all the women just smiled at me like, yep, we sure do. And so you know what? The guys know too. They know. And a lot of times these people that sort of hang around and they kind of wear victims down and take advantage of vulnerabilities are the ones that we wouldn't even be afraid of. They're sort of an irritant more than anything else. But we need to give them the same amount of attention as the guy that is more overtly manipulative. So the affirmative consent model. Bottom line, the burden should be on the person who states consent was given. So what we need to do is, again, ask the suspect how consent was given and to describe it in detail. Tell me what she or he did that let you know he or she consented. Get as detailed with the suspect as with the victim, focusing on experiential and sensory information. Ask the subject if he was talking to the victim, asking what she wanted and how at each step the victim continued to articulate consent. They will likely have to make up that level of detail because we know it didn't happen. Inconsistencies. When addressing inconsistencies, I ask the subject to verify certain facts and to answer why he thinks the victim would say X, Y, or Z. For example, so-and-so said she'd vomited or could not stand up without your help or was ministrating and would never have consensual sex while ministrating. Do you remember this? So why did you think that she was saying she did consent under these circumstances? And let him answer. The absurdities are things like vomit or a tampon in a woman or sex acts that go beyond the victim's experience, like anal sex, lack of contraception, or lack of protection from STDs. If the suspect admits the victim had thrown up, for example, then it's important to have the suspect explain why he thought she had the ability to consent. It's harder for a jury to believe consent was given when this type of picture is painted. Additionally, what if the victim was wearing a tampon and the non-consensual sex caused her tampon to be jammed into her cervix? So far, it couldn't be removed without assistance. Ask the suspect about using protection and what conversation he had with the victim about this type of protection. Because at the beginning, they have to say something about how they like this person. So we just keep going with how they like this person. It would be extrapolated that they wanted to be sensitive and take care of this person. And when you start asking these kind of questions, it gets harder for them to answer. Now, I love the polygraph, and we should always consider it. It's a great tool. Sell it as a way to clear of wrongdoing. So the acceptance of the polygraph, it keeps moving that ball down the field. They are not admissible in court, but that doesn't matter. There's a high rate of success in polygraph interrogations. Know your agency's administrative policy regarding the request of a polygraph, and just know that in most states it is illegal for you to ask a victim as a condition of proceeding with the investigation or a filing of charges that they are required to take a polygraph. So just don't do it. The fact a polygraph test is not admissible in court should never preclude our consideration. The acceptance of a polygraph, again, moves it down the field. The test itself is not admissible, but it is at a probable cause hearing. So it's not admissible at trial, but it is at a probable cause hearing. Even if on the day of the polygraph test, the suspect declines to actually take the polygraph test, they are then subjected to an interrogation unless they invoke their rights and now leave the appointment that they showed up for. Remember, there are two parts, the test itself and the interrogation. And the polygraph examiners that I worked with were exceptional interviewers and interrogators. A large percentage of those who agree to take the polygraph test provide confessions through polygraph-originated interrogations. We're going to finish our training with a case study, the People versus Brock Turner. This is a case that did go to trial and where the suspect was convicted. We'll look at the aftermath of that conviction and how it both created a narrative for a much larger and important conversation about sexual assault, and also how it challenged a community, causing unintended results as a result of the collective outrage on both sides. This story involves the recall of the judge in this case regarding his use of sentencing discretion and how that, as a result, changed a law in California. The moral of this story is our story as sexual assault investigators remains. The landscape of attitudes on sexual assault and criminal punishment is still complicated.